Right, we'll get started with the next one. So our next speaker is Mark Pearl. Mark works at Driven Software, and I'll just quickly introduce him to you. Mark is a developer coach for Driven Software, a Johannesburg-based consultancy firm focusing on assisting teams delivering high-quality software. Mark also has a passion for software craftsmanship and is actively involved in promoting it in South Africa. From co-hosting the Driven to Distraction podcast to organizing events for the developer user group, if there is an event happening related to software development in Joburg, you'll find Mark there. So, what are you talking about today?
Agile documentation.
So Mark's speaking on Agile documentation, and over to Mark. Welcome.
Thanks, Yanku, for taking the first 5 minutes of my presentation. I just want to check the volume. Can people hear me at the back, or do I need to use a microphone? If you can hear me, put your hand up. You can hear it? Good. Great. Well, second day. Thank you for making this session. As Yanku said, I'm a developer coach from Driven Software, and just to elaborate on what Driven does is we're a Johannesburg-based consultancy firm. We work with other companies in having a deep understanding of how to create working software. So I get nervous when people say, well, you Agile this or Agile that, because Agile is really just a medium by which we get software to work. In 5 years' time, if there's a better thing, I hope to be embracing that rather than Agile. That said, I have no idea what type of audience I have here. Hands up if you are a coder or programmer. Okay, thank you. Hands up if you're a business analyst. Any BAs here? Interesting. Do we have any dev managers? Kevin, put your hand down. Sorry, he's my boss. Do we have anybody at an executive level? Okay, so we've got some people in senior management as well. Do we have any software developers here? So, software developers and coders are a different thing for me. Often I go into an audience and I'll ask the team, who are the software developers, and all the programmers will put their hands up, but nobody else will. And for me, anybody involved in the process of creating software is a software developer. So, just to kind of set expectations, where did this talk kind of come from? Well, I think it originated from the Agile Manifesto. And what the Agile Manifesto said is, we value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. And for the next 30 minutes, we're going to focus on the second line, which says working software over comprehensive documentation. So I want to share a quick story, a bit of a thing that happened in my past. When I started in this industry, I was this young developer in a small company, and we would meet once every couple months, kind of ironic, to see how we could improve our process. And every single time, without fail, the topic would come up that we weren't professional because we weren't documenting enough. And we beat ourselves up over this fact. And eventually, when I was introduced to Agile methodologies, I came out, this massive burden was lifted off my shoulders, because I thought, Agile means no documentation, I'm finally a professional developer. Well, that's not true. I guess if you're not able to create working software, then there's no need for documentation. But any of us that are creating working software, we understand that documentation forms a very critical part of getting software to work. And just to highlight that the manifesto actually agrees with this. They say, while we see value in the things on the right, we value the things on the left more. So, when do Agile teams create documentation? This is the graph I found on the site by Scott Ambler. And Scott had, first of all, I'm going to refer to a lot of his material because he's done a lot of writings on this topic. And he mapped out basically a traditional effort versus time mapping. So total effort on the vertical, time on the horizontal, and in a traditional project you would typically see a lot of effort up front in establishing exactly what we're doing, how we're going to do it, documenting it. And then it would kind of leverage off a bit, and near the end there would be a slight bump. Who here relates to this? Who's experienced this before? Okay, that's interesting. Now, if you compare this to to Agile documentation, Scott represented it slightly differently. He's not saying that there is no documentation in an Agile team, but the types of documents are different, and the amount of effort placed in it is different. Initially, there's very little effort placed in that documentation, and kind of as he represented, as you get closer to finishing the project, there's this little bump at the end where things have hardened down and you want to document it. So I work with Donnie and Kevin, who are speaking later today, and they keep saying this thing every time I see them. It turns out they were quoting George Fox, and George says, all models are wrong, some are more useful than others. And if I look at Scott's graph, I have two issues with it. The first is, he hasn't represented this concept of living documentation in his effort. And I think if he did that, we would see it represented differently. And then the second one that I had a big issue with was, if you're starting an Agile project and a traditional project and they're ending at the same time, and you're creating the documentation at the same time, you probably missed the point. Now, one of the fundamental things of Agile is we want quick feedback. This graph should be better having little bumps going along as we're releasing to get that feedback from others. So, in line with that thought, I think a lot of the documentation we create is a product of the environment that we're in. And I think in South Africa we've got it wrong. We're making our projects way too big. David Joyce spoke yesterday, and first time I've seen David speak was a couple of years ago. I was watching a video of Lean Kanban in Central Europe, and he was going through this topic about transforming the traditional PMO to the 21st century. I'd really recommend, if you haven't watched that video, give it a watch. But for like a minute, he touched on the subject. He said he didn't like user stories at a high level because they weren't really controlling this idea that what we're doing might not be the right thing. So he recommended replacing some of your user stories at a high level with the Cynefin model. If you're not familiar with the Cynefin model, I'd really suggest you look into it. But basically what it does is it's a way of saying we have this hypothesis, we have this experiment, let's go do it. If it's right, how do we magnify that? If it's wrong, how do we reverse the effects of it? Now, is this possible to get in a large organization? I think it's going to be extremely hard. And the reason it's going to be hard is you'll find that organizations, particularly large ones, are structured in such a way that they don't encourage small experiments. It just seems wrong that to get funding for a 2 to 3 month project requires exactly the same amount of effort and controls that you have to go through to get funding for a 2-year project. Until we change that model, until we change how we actually motivate projects, we're going to battle to get this to work. But if you're in an organization that can embrace this, I think it's a really, really good idea to try to see how you can get this feedback and control this going. Who decides on what documentation to create? Do I have any suggestions? Anybody want to kind of hazard a guess?
Compliance.
Sorry?
Compliance decides.
Compliance. Okay, so that's a fair one. Any others? Yes?
The project team and approach to execute that specific project.
A project team. So, in fact, a lot of these people are all involved in determining the documentation you create. But ultimately, it comes up to being a business decision. And that, for me, is really, really important. Documentation has a cost involved in it. It's going to take time. It's going to take people's time. It's going to require effort. And the stakeholders that are actually paying for that project should be motivating and making the final say on whether something should be documented or not. That doesn't mean that if they don't ask for something, you don't do it. We have a responsibility for educating our stakeholders on the risks and the benefits and the return on investment and the cost of ownership of these documents. And we should be pushing back. If we see that documents are being created for a political reason or out of ignorance, we should really be pushing back to our stakeholders not to create them. On the other side, if we see a gap where there should be some documentation because it's going to add value to the process, we should be really motivating. But ultimately, it's the stakeholders that are paying for this that should have the final say whether they're happy to pay for it. A question I like to ask time and time again with documentation is, does the cost of the documentation, is the value added by the documentation more than the cost? So if the value is more, easy decision. If it's less, don't do it. Quite simple. Another question that comes up quite a bit is, does documentation need to be in a written form? Now, a really useful model is the Agile fluency model, and in it, they basically use a way of judging the level of fluency that a team is at. And I come across a lot of teams that say that they're Agile. Yes, we're doing our daily stand-ups, we're doing our sprint planning, we're doing our scrums, whatever. But they have no concept of a build server or continuous integration or anything like that. Those teams on the Agile fluency model, for me, sit at a 1-star level. So the Agile fluency model divides teams up into 4 categories. And really the first category, or 1-star team, is, are they focusing on value? The 2nd-star team is really, are they consistently delivering value? And to consistently deliver value, you have to rely on the technical practices that are there to support Agile. These are things like automated unit tests, automated acceptance tests, all sorts of things like that. Those are forms of living documentation. The reason we call them living is because they are tied, they're in sync with our system. They're giving us feedback on the state of the system. If that document falls out of sync with the system, it triggers a flag. Somebody goes and has a look and updates it. Just a quick tip from our side. We've worked with various teams, and if you're a team that has build servers and continuous integration environments, we found that a push mechanism works really, really well in this situation. So to get a team to own the value of the system, make it visible to them, a great technique is put up a monitor in the team room, displays to the whole world the state of the system and the documentation attached to it. You'll find that teams have a lot more ownership when that's visible in public instead of when they have to log into some site to see if the thing actually built or not. Do documents need to be comprehensive? So, when I was a kid, I really, really loved a set of books called Where's Wally? And when I was practicing this talk with my wife, she stopped me because she was trying to find Wally. So we figured we'd save you the time. He's over there. That said, the reason why Where's Wally was so fun was there was this little bit of important information that you needed to get to. And you look on this page and there's just tons and tons of stuff. And you'd spend hours and hours looking for it. Well, in the traditional sense, we see a lot of traditional documentation suffering from the Where's Wally syndrome. We have comprehensive documentation really hides the useful stuff. Be careful not to record the obvious for the intended reader of the document. Focus on the useful stuff. Comprehensive documentation does not ensure project success. In fact, comprehensive documentation can actually hinder the success of a project. Keep that in mind. Be careful of what you put in. In line with documentation, another little tip I've seen is this problem with templates. So, yes, there's value in having documents that are templates as a starting place. But one of the challenges I've seen with templates is often we put too much in them. And then the person filling in the template almost has this emotional obligation that they have to fill in every space in the template. And you end up with very, very comprehensive documentation that's adding no value. When you make templates, be careful. Be careful that you're not creating an emotional need in the people filling it to put unuseful stuff. When do I update documents? Well, there's a cost in writing documents. There's a cost in maintaining them. Sometimes there's value in creating a document but not maintaining it. Sometimes there's value in creating a document and maintaining it. And sometimes there's value in not doing either, just not creating the document in the first place. I like to think of two stories that kind of guide me in when to update documents. And the first is this idea that a document needs to be up to date to be useful. Now, we know that phone books are becoming extinct. But back in the days when I used to use a phone book, I would rarely use the most up-to-date phone book. In fact, I would get lots of value from phone books that weren't up-to-date because the stuff that was important to me was still there and was useful. In line with that thought, when I was studying formally, at the beginning of each semester, we would look at the subjects that we were doing and the material in the textbooks prescribed. And we make a judgment call. Can I get away with last year's textbook and save the money and still pass the subject? Or do I need to buy the new textbook? Do I actually have to invest the money in that textbook to pass? And that's the same judgment call we need to do in the documentation that we write. Are we willing to pay the cost for it to be up to date? Or can we be comfortable with it being up to date and still being useful? Fundamentally, for me, Agile documentation is about changing perspectives. If we looked at a traditional sense of what documentation was, it's about being a form of communication. Agile documentation changes that mindset a bit. Instead of being a form of communication, it's a mechanism or trigger to communicate. Now, you see various models of communication. The one I've put up here is called the media richness model. And basically it's rating the effective forms of communication. At the very top, face-to-face communication. As you work your way down, you'll see near the bottom, written documentation. I was on a journeyman course run by Martin and Jacques recently, and they spoke about this concept of bandwidth and latency. We want to encourage communication where we have high bandwidth, low latency. Unfortunately, written communication focus at low bandwidth, high latency. Another thing is we can often miss the point of what the written communication was trying to get across. This is an example I saw with a client last week. I saw it in their canteen. I was busy ordering lunch and it said grilled marinated chicken served with a choice of boerewors, or tender steak, puffin gravy, and chakalaka or coleslaw. And I wanted to know, do I get the steak with the chicken and the puffin gravy and chakalaka, or is chakalaka another option and the gravy separate? And I actually wasn't sure. Eventually, I had to rely on my Agile skills and ask the cook serving the meal. And he explained it to me. But you see, the problem is we create hundreds and hundreds of pages of these things. And then we expect to hand that to somebody to go and write a system, and we wonder why it comes out on the other end messed up. This is an example of written communication being really, really important. You'll see that a lot of Agile documentation intentionally leaves out information. I'll take user stories as an example. Now, I'm a big fan of writing user stories on sticky notes or on little cardboard pieces. And the reason I like that isn't just because it's tactile and you can feel it. It's because it's limiting what you can put on it. It's forcing you to actually, when you want to implement this thing, go and speak to somebody to find out what they meant about it. Instead of, in isolation, figuring it out because it's written down. That's fundamentally, for me, what Agile documentation is about. It's about identifying who is this conversation we're meant to be having with, and how do we start that conversation. So before we go through to questions, just want to summarize some key points on whether your documentation is agile. And these come from Scott's site. Really, really good read. He says, does your documentation maximize stakeholder return on investment? Are they getting the most value for what you're doing? Secondly, do your stakeholders understand the total cost of ownership? That's not just the cost to pay somebody to write, it's the cost to maintain it. Is that understanding clear? Is your documentation sufficient? Is there enough to get going? Does it fulfill its purpose? Does it describe the good things to know, not just remove the obvious, just the good things, the useful things? And finally, does it have a specific customer, and is it sufficiently accurate and consistent in detail? For me, the important thing in that last line is the sufficiently part. It doesn't need to be perfectly accurate and detailed, just sufficiently accurate and detailed. And with that, we've got a few minutes. Questions?
Any questions? Right.
Yeah, so one question that I have is, so a big part of Agile engineering is about living documentation and having tests that explain what the system does in a way that kind of always keeps in sync with the code itself. Do you have any tips for how to help business people understand what that means?
I struggle enough to explain that to developers. But I think the best way that they can see and understand it is actually see it working. We can have these conversations about how to add value, etc., but it's really when you look back and you look at how the system was coming out before you had those things versus when you implemented them, the difference it makes, the confidence it gives your team to move forward. That's when they start seeing the value. You can really discuss these things ad nauseum, but I think the saying like quick experiments, short experiments with quick feedback really kind of lays into that as well. I'm interested to see, we have a mix of people here. Who are you in teams that are creating living documentation or some sort of automated unit test, acceptance test criteria? Just a show of hands. Okay. Who of you are aware of it but haven't ever been able to implement it? That's kind of my experience, is specifically for teams where there's a lot of flux, a lot of people coming in and going out. It's really hard for those teams to get to grips on these things. And then secondly, it's really hard to get these things going if you haven't done it before. So it's very useful to find somebody that's done it and just get them to show you how to do it.
Love your talk, especially though it wasn't really about documentation. It was wonderful. I also like what you said about templates, and I sort of feel like the new Agile template is as I need to so that, and I find that a lot of people are reading sentences to each other instead of telling stories. Could you share some of your experiences with that?
So I've fallen into that trap as well. I went through, must have been 2 years saying no, you need to have an actor, a reason, a motivation. And then looking at the teams where we really saw an impact. In one team, it was a developer and a product owner, and they would sit down once every 2 weeks for an hour, and they would just have these random pieces of paper written down, and they'd have a conversation about that. Templates are really, really useful as a starting point, but that's not what it's about. And if you get caught up on that for too long, you start seeing diminished return in value. So my advice is start off with the rote as those kind of template-based things, and then when you start seeing communication that's happening, back off on making sure that everything's ticked and crossed off. That's not the purpose. Did that answer your question? Anything else?
Do we have time to some?
How many teams do you see are using Wiki for communication?
So, how many teams do I see using wikis and blogs for communication?
Would you recommend it or not?
So, I recommend putting people in a room and letting them talk. In fact, even when you put them in a room, it's sometimes hard to get them to talk. So I hate cubicles. I want to bash down cubicles every time I see it because even those things stop people to talk. I want to put people in a room where they can make eye contact with each other. I find that in this industry, we have a tendency to over-technologize these solutions. Now, that doesn't mean that wikis and blogs aren't an effective form of communication. In certain circumstances, if you have a distributed team, that's how you're going to work. But my recommendation is to fight back on that as much as possible. One of the tips with documentation, for instance, is, there's this big question about what repository do we store this in? Does it go in the share thingy or whatever? And my recommendation is, if you're going to even have written documentation, we have a repository where we put our source code. Let's put the documentation in the same thing. Now, the benefit we get from that is we can see how old these things are and who made changes. So utilize blogs, utilize things like that, but don't let that be the crutch. Use them when they're necessary.
You're responsible for infrastructure solution design. How does Agile play a role in that more Agile documentation?
So I don't know what that means, infrastructure solution. But one of the concerns I've had, just in general, is there's this mindset that, Agile is suitable for certain projects but not for others, and you could use traditional documentation, traditional processes and stuff like that. And I'm worried that the message of Agile is getting diluted. I've seen Agile practices being very, very effective in a range of solutions. The type of practices you apply might be different. So you've got to ask yourself, are we sitting in a high variability environment? Is it a low variability? What's the period of time that we're working on? When do things change? And then kind of pick your poison for that. There's some really, really effective practices in the Agile field that can not just cover your documentation, but can cover a whole bunch of things. Like, an interesting one for me is the whole concept of audits. It's a concern we get on documentation in an Agile environment. Are we going to pass our audit? And I've been in teams where they passed audits quite cleanly. What they did, though, was the discussion with the auditor was, what is the purpose of this auditor? What are they doing here? And establishing that up front and kind of covering the boundaries of where you have to operate is really, really important. The advice I would give is, if you're in infrastructure, don't try to take a one model and apply it to everything. I saw a support team a couple of years back, and they said to us, the Scrum is really, really great, but we really struggle in planning. I said, well, why do you struggle in planning? Well, we put cards up on the board that say support calls, and we allocate 200 points every 2 weeks. But we never quite show who's going to phone in or not, and it's never quite right. Now, that's a good example of taking the wrong practices and applying it to the wrong model. What they didn't need Scrum. They needed something else. And there were things in the Lean and Agile world that solved their problems. But that for me is a big concern, is just taking this one size fits all and sticking it on, and then not looking at the process and adjusting it. I don't think I've really answered your question. But I'm going to have a rant.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Mark. And,